So hey there folks, I hope you're all doing really well. I wanted to follow up my previous video all about restoring Super Famicom games with the process of how I basically take labels from grotty game cartridges and transplant them onto nice clean shells that have been sourced from games that are available here in Japan, particularly for next to no money, because nobody wants pachinko games, nobody wants the old soccer games in general, and so on and so forth, and they're generally available for very cheap, those games, and it's an ideal way to basically save yourself a bit of money to help restore games to their former glory. So without further ado, let's crack on with the video. So at the very outset, I take no responsibility for any damage that you do to your games by following the methods that I show in this video. If you do any damage to your games, I'm afraid that's on you. All I can say is that I have always had success with these methods by basically taking things nice and slow, patiently, and just not rushing and just taking my time with these things. I've only had one instance where the label would not budge from a game cartridge shell, and that was with this copy of Super Bomberman 3, but I backed out of trying to remove the label when I realised that it just wasn't going to happen, and I'll show you the end result of that particular restoration in this video. So what do I mean about restoring these game cartridges? Well, often you'll find a game that's, you want to buy. For example, Smash TV here. I picked this up 2.5 years ago in Kyoto. But the front shell was really yellowed, like the back, because I've yet to replace the back on this particular game here. And also, the previous owner had written their name on the top here, and sometimes you get it on the shell on the front here as well, and it just looks really unsightly. So what I do is I buy cheap games for like 100 yen plus the tax, like Prime Goal and pachinko games and golf games that nobody is buying here in Japan, and I use those shells to improve the quality of the games, and it means that I can get games that I want to play for a lot cheaper than they would ordinarily cost. And then gradually what I can do is I can eventually source the boxes and the manuals, for example, for these games separately, and overall with a bit of patience I can put together complete games, if I can use that phrase, for a lot less money than what it costs to basically source these games from glass cabinets from these second-hand stores and retro gaming stores that are here in Japan. So what will you need to do this? Well, you will need some isopropyl alcohol. This helps clean up the electrical contacts on cartridges, as well as removing some of the more stubborn sort of dirt and grime that you get on these cartridge shells. You'll need some lighter fluid. This is what you're going to use to remove that label from the front of the shell. A toothbrush is recommended for really giving those electrical contacts a scrub on those game cartridge shells. A game bit screwdriver. This will help remove those star-shaped nuts that are on a lot of these older games. A nice sharp blade. I use these X-Acto knives with slightly blunt blades because that means that as you use this to pry up the corner of the label, you're not likely to cut into the label and damage it. And some cotton buds or Q-tips, which basically you can use to again clean up electrical contacts, as well as get into slightly more difficult to clean areas such as this recess in the front of the Super Famicom cartridge shells. So those are the basic tools that you're going to need. I'd also recommend a timer, be that a stopwatch on your watch or your phone, or a cooking timer, just so you can monitor how long you've put the lighter fluid on the label, because you don't want to leave it on there too long, as well as some kitchen towel or some toilet paper or something like that, which will allow you to basically mop up any of the excess IPA or lighter fluid at the appropriate time when you're doing the restoration process. So without further ado, let me show you the overall process. The process for removing the label from the donor cart starts with applying some lighter fluid to one edge of the label. I make sure I don't use too much, and I mop up any excess with some tissue. Then using a timer, I just make sure I don't leave the lighter fluid sat there for much more than 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes, absolute maximum. Then using the sharp blade, I very slowly and gently pry up one corner of the label, and then using the blunt edge of the blade, gently ease that underneath one edge of the label to prise it up fully. I only start to remove the label properly once I'm content that I've managed to get a corner of the label up properly. I will then use a little bit more lighter fluid just under the label, just to help ease it up from when I begin to peel it away. To do this, again, I use the blunt edge of the blade just to gently sort of swipe underneath the label, and eventually once enough of the label is up and away from the cartridge shell, I can then use my fingers behind the label to add a bit of reinforcement as I pull that label up, because I don't want to do this too quickly because I may rip the label, or I might end up leaving some of the adhesive side on the cartridge or damage it in some way. So I just very, very gently work that blade underneath the label whilst the finger on the other side stops it from jerking up all of a sudden. I may use a little bit of extra lighter fluid at various points if the label becomes resistant to being pulled up, and then eventually you'll get all the way across the label and be able to pull it away with ease. I then spend my time cleaning up the donor cartridge shell, using the toothbrush and cotton buds, using a bit of IPA and maybe just a little bit of soap and water as well, just to get it as good as possible before I transplant the label onto this new donor front fascia. Likewise, I'll clean up the back of the shell if I'm also transplanting that. It's worth spending a bit of time here because once you've transplanted that label on, you're not going to be able to do as thorough a job as you can now. So again, a bit of time and patience really pays off here. This is the existing shell to the Ganbare Goemon game that I want to replace the front and back on, and as you can see, the previous owner's name is on this cartridge, so that's reason enough to do this process. But you can see on the back that it's also quite yellowed and mottled, so it's ideal for basically transplanting into a new, better conditioned donor's shell. To do this, I used a game bit to take apart the existing shell, and that will get the front and back away and reveal the PCB inside. At this point, I use a bit of IPA and a cotton bud to clean up the gold contacts on the cartridge itself, to get them nice and clean, just to take any of the residue that has built up over the years of perhaps not being used, to make sure that this works when plugged into the Super Famicom in this case. There's no point putting extra stress on the cartridge connector in the console itself by unplugging and replugging when you want to try and get it to work. And then the process for removing the label from this shell is just the same as from the donor cartridge. Exactly the same, just take your time and eventually the label will come away without a struggle. I will also make sure that there is no excess lighter fluid by mopping up the label so the lamination layer doesn't peel away. And then to reapply the label to the donor front shell, all I have to do is stick it back down. The lighter fluid won't damage the adhesive nature of the label, and you shouldn't need any extra adhesive or glue to stick the label down. So I just take my time, pushing just from one edge of the label across to the other to ensure no air bubbles develop as I reapply it, and to make sure that the label is nice and straight. I then take apart the donor cartridge, which I'm going to use the back for, but one of the things you may notice is that early Super Famicom cartridges, the back label and design is ever so slightly different on the older games like this Ganbare Goemon game here. So that may be something that you want to be careful of if you're really intent on making sure that everything is period correct. I'm not so bothered about that personally, but maybe one day I'll find the correct back for this restored game. And then it's just a matter of reassembling the game by putting the PCB into the donor back shell, and then I can put it back together with the front, putting the bolts using the game bit screwdriver to make one fully completed restored game cartridge. We're now on a homeward stretch. I bought these inner boxes or inner inlays for the Super Famicom from AliExpress because sometimes they can get a bit yellowed and cracked and so forth. So I placed the little bits that came with the game into that and put my game back into its little plastic bag along with the manual. And it's just a matter of sliding all back into its outer box very carefully. And there you have it. One fully restored Super Famicom game. Well, sort of anyway. The cartridge looks great anyway. This was a game that I picked up in Sioux City. It was 300 yen plus tax, so 330 yen in the junk bin. And the reason for that was because it lacked the manual, which is not unusual, but the game cartridge itself was really disgusting. I mean, it looked like it had some yakisoba stains or some ketchup stains from the 90s on it. It was really grim. But luckily, most of that grimness was kept to the back piece, where it was also had the previous owner's name written on it. It was just really grim. Now, I tried to get the label off of this one, but it just would not budge, so I decided I'm not going to do that. I'll replace the back piece and I will clean up the front as best I can, and it's not perfect, as you can see. It's still got a bit of a stain sort of around this region here, but overall it's not turned out too bad. And then separately I sourced a manual from Suragaya online for about 400 yen. It's not a perfect copy of the manual, but it's pretty good. I'm not a perfect collection, perfect condition, that's the word, perfect condition retro gamer, as long as it's all pretty serviceable and looks nice enough and all the rest of it, that's good enough for me. So for basically 700 to 800 yen, and it also included the little AC adapter warning notice, the little postcard to send back to Hudson with the feedback for the game, which I'll be sure to send back, as I always joke, as well as this lovely little advertisement for the Super Multi-Tap. That's basically now a complete game for 700 to 800 yen, I think it would have cost in total. So a real bargain, especially as Super Bomberman 3 is really expensive in regions outside of Japan. To be honest with you, it's not an overly expensive game here in Japan. I think you can generally pick up half decent box copies for anywhere in the region of about 1,500 to 2,500 yen here. But compared to the release in the PAL territories, that's still a really good price. But the fact that I put this together complete with a really nice looking box, you know, there's nothing wrong with the box at all, for about 700 to 800 yen is fantastic. That's my kind of bargain, so not too bad. And then I showed you Gradius in the previous video about this topic, so I'm not going to go through this in full, but on this particular one I have now replaced the front shell by transplanting the label, which is what obviously this video's topic was all about, and now you can see that that looks so much better than what it did. I mean, this was a very cheap game that I paid about 500 yen for in Aomori Prefecture at the branch of Yorozuya in Hachinohe, and that now looks really beautiful. And yeah, obviously we all know that the Super Famicom or the Super Nintendo port of Gradius 3 has slowed down, but it is still a wonderful, wonderful game to play. And by basically sourcing the manual and the box for next to no money really, I was able to put together a complete copy of this game for very, very little money. And again, it's not an overly expensive game to find here in Japan complete. I mean, you're probably looking at around about 2,500 to 3,000 yen these days, I think, for a really good copy of this game. So yeah, that's not bad going. I think overall it was worth me doing, and now I've basically brought all these bits of components, the box, the manual, and a slightly ratty game into really nice condition. So it's a nice little restoration, that, and a game that I play pretty frequently, to be honest with you. And then we've got the copy of Gambari Goemon Yukihime Kyushutsu Emaki, which I talked about in my Nagoya shopping video. Yes, the box is a bit dinged and bashed up in places, but it's serviceable for what I paid for it. So I've replaced the back and the front, and by basically putting a label on there, this is now a lovely condition game. All of the previous owners' yakisoba spills and ketchup and God knows what else has all been swept away by basically using a nicely cleaned up shell. And yeah, the manual that came in this game is a little bit rumpled and crumpled, but otherwise it is now a complete copy of this fantastic game. And it means that instead of languishing on some shelf being unloved, I can now enjoy playing this game and give it the attention that I think it deserves. You know, and you know, the funny thing is that in the Nagoya video, and sometimes in other videos that I put out about my exploits with retro gaming and maybe gaming here in general, as somebody who lives in Japan, I sometimes get accused of ruining Japan, apparently. I'm not sure how I do that. I can think of more egregious ways in which I ruin Japan, but by basically buying unloved games that are just languishing on shop shelves, not being bought because they're in poor condition, and then restoring them and basically giving them a bit of love by playing them and cherishing them, I'm not entirely sure how I'm single-handedly ruining Japan. But, you know, there again, I don't really worry too much about the comments that I get get on YouTube, because frankly some of them are just bizarre, and I think they say more about the people leaving the comments than they do about myself. But obviously if you share the opinion that I'm destroying Japan by restoring these video games to their former glory and playing them and giving them a bit of love, then wow, what can I say really? I'm sorry, but not really that sorry to be honest with you, because I feel that I'm actually doing these games a good turn. It's not like I'm flipping them on eBay or Yahoo auctions, is it, for a profit? I'm enjoying them for myself. But anyway, that's the process. As I say, I take no responsibility for any damage that you do to your games by following this method. I've basically always taken my time doing this and been patient and all the rest of it. It's always worked out for me. But if you have any questions about this process, about how to go about it or anything else to do with it, do be sure to throw them into the comments. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.